Welcome to the CTA Podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA Podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Zyl and Christine Siefen.
Welcome, everybody, to Critical Therapy Antidote Podcast. I am Christine Siefen, and I'm with my co-host today, Jaco van Zyl. And we're really excited to have with us Bonnie Snyder, who I worked with on a couple projects myself. So I have a bit of a history with Bonnie, and I'm so honored that you're here with us today, Bonnie. Bonnie is formerly with FIRE organization and currently has launched a new organization called Terra Firma Teaching Alliance. And their motto is pedagogy and not ideology. And so this is an organization that's geared toward teachers and educators for K through 12 schools. Is that right, Bonnie?
Yep, absolutely.
So can you tell us a bit about how Terra Firma came to be, and also just a little bit more about your background? I know that you were a counselor for many years and also taught for many years. So share a little bit with us about that history as well.
Yeah, I think having worked in schools, I was an English teacher, I was a school counselor, and then I taught at the college level psychology for a number of years. Educators are some of the finest people that I've ever had the honor to work with. And I've, go to a lot of teaching conferences, and I just know from personal experience that there are a lot of teachers who are not on board with the activist, heavy-handed ideology that is being promoted in too many schools these days. And so our goal is to connect with those teachers. So please reach out if that is you listening. We want to support those teachers. We want to connect them. We want to talk about strategies, because we know that within schools, it only takes a few people. I mean, I refuse to believe that these heavy-handed ideologues are the majority in the schools. I think that they're good at appearing to be more than they are. I think there are too many of them. But I know that many really good, trustworthy teachers are intimidated by what's going on, and that if they just feel that they have some support, some colleagues who agree with them, that they'll be able to right the ship and restore some balance to what's going on in our schools. So that is our goal at Terra Firma.
Great. And one thing I wanted to ask you, we've talked about this briefly before and even earlier before we started today, about kind of the group that thinks, okay, let's stick with this and try to change from the inside of the organization. And then those of us who have left and said, you know what, I'm going to leave, I'm going to take a stand and speak out. And you made a good point, where if people continue to do that, that just leaves more space for more ideologues to come in and fill in the gaps. So I wanted to ask you just, a bit about your advice or your thoughts about kind of those two positions, staying within and trying to change from the inside out, and also the people who said, no, I'm going to leave and speak out. Because I think there are a lot of people right now, and I know with CTA, we see this a lot, that are sort of on this cusp of, what do I do now with my career, with the direction I'm going? How do I navigate this? So I wanted to hear from you a bit about that.
Yeah, I think there are two competing schools of thought on how to address this current dumpster fire of a situation that we're having throughout academia. And it's particularly sad when it's K-12, when we're talking about children who don't even have, their minds and their views aren't even fully developed. So that is a particularly vulnerable group of people. And I do understand the impulse to want to burn it all down and start over again. And I pointed out that I think that if you've ever read Atlas Shrugged, that's sort of the plot line there, is that as long as good, hardworking people prop up a bad system, you're feeding it energy, and the right thing to do is to walk away. That's the position of that book. The alternative view, which is the one that I think I'm going to come from, is this metaphor that we've heard. You might have heard of this: walking on the beach, and a man comes across a bunch of stranded starfish, right? Because the tide has gone out. So he starts picking them up, but there are thousands of them, and he starts throwing them back in, and someone else comes along and says, well, you're wasting your time. You can't save all of them. What you're doing isn't going to make a difference. And he throws one back and said, yeah, but I made a difference to that one. So I think it's when we're talking about children, the burn it down approach, to say that, well, these current schools are ridiculous. What are we going to do? Let them loose like feral cats and then just say, we'll start fresh in a generation. This will just be a lost generation. It's different when we're talking about adults, I think, than it is with children. And I think we have to do the best by them in this current system as we build a replacement, or, as we improve, as we shore up the current problem.
Yeah, that's my question. What would you say? How would that look when you're saying that we're not doing the dumpster fire strategy? We're trying to save each school, each child one by one. How would that look?
Well, I think that there are a number of new school alternatives that, I think school choice is, and here's another argument. I do know that there are some wonderful schools that are being built. I would single out maybe Vertex in the Bronx, which has a very agentic curriculum, meaning it focuses on student agency. We do work with teachers who are looking for better school positions. So I think providing, I guess what I would say is that market forces can help to right this ship. I know that there is, and then the argument against that, see, I can do both sides of these arguments and work myself into a corner, is the unions, right? That the unions have so much power. And I'll point out that there is something, and I'm not promoting this, but I've heard that there's something called the Teacher Freedom Summit that's going to be happening in Denver, where it is teachers who are not happy about the union stronghold in their schools. So they're, I guess my answer is that it has to be a multi-pronged approach. I mean, for one thing, we have this parent army that is, showing up at school boards, and I think that they have been, they are scaring the heck out of school administrators and teachers. And I think that there has been some pullback on some of the more outrageous activities that have been going on in schools, because they realize that the parents are now aware, the parents are watching. A lot of this has happened in the dark, in the shadows. So
Yes.
the parents push back, the teachers push back, and interestingly, we're starting to see students pushing back as well. I just talked to a group in Massachusetts where there have been a couple of student revolts, not just there, but there have been like 3 different student revolts in Massachusetts, where students are sick of being told that they have to celebrate this and applaud that, and that they don't even get to have their own opinions or views or voices, which is very, very un-American. So maybe that is the approach that it comes from, and that might be the most effective one of all, is the students pushing back. I mean, like, why, if they can't even think freely, then yeah, and incidentally, if for those who are interested, I also wrote a book about why it's important for students to be able to think freely, to learn freely, to speak freely, and it's called Undoctrinate.
That is such a fabulous book. I actually used that book and a lot of the references in there to build a presentation on how some of this ideology negatively affects kids in the classroom and the importance of civil discourse. So I'm just going to give a nice big plug for that book right now, because it is absolutely brilliant, and it has a ton of cited resources, original source material that people can go and look up. So, Bonnie, that certainly has been, and I used that when I was with FAIR to create multiple presentations. So I want to really commend you for putting that together.
And it was a chance for me to sort of pull together everything that I had learned. There are reasons why we don't do this. Teachers have not done this for centuries for very good reasons. And so I tried to just pull together what those reasons are. And like philosophical reasons, there's pedagogical reasons, there's developmental reasons, there's emotional reasons, and then there's legal reasons why we don't do this. And then there's democratic reasons. Like, if you start using the public school for political aims, you lose the trust of the public, which is exactly what's happened. And so, why are you surprised? You shouldn't be surprised. And I do have sympathy for some of these younger teachers that they themselves probably were not taught well. And so I can forgive ignorance up to a point, but as they like to say, educate yourself. Like, educate yourselves. There are reasons
Yes.
why, teachers have refrained from doing this with a captive audience of other people's minor children. So, but I'm also all for new school alternatives. I see nothing wrong with that. Yeah, again, captive audience, and these kids need to be set free. They need to be not held captive.
So disengagement might not be the best strategy for this current situation.
Well, I think a lot of the students are disengaged from this kind of really, the other thing about this kind of pseudo education is that it's boring. And I think that's, a lot of these teachers think what they're doing is really edgy and really cutting edge. It's not. It's tired. It's worn out. It's superficial. It's oversimplified. It's boring. And it's not surprising that we're concurrently seeing an anti-test movement in the United States. I don't know if that's happening in other countries as well. But it was like somebody on one of our Terraform calls pointed out that, we were talking discipline, because that's a whole other issue that's going on, and restorative justice, and kids out of control, and teachers not getting the support from the administration that they need. And, one of the teachers pointed out that the best preventative for misbehavior in class is a good lesson plan. And I like to joke that, you could fill books with what these kids don't know, but what they're giving them instead is attitudes. And there's an old joke that, in Sunday school, if you don't know, and forgive me, but it's a joke. It's like, in Sunday school, if you don't know what the right answer is, just say Jesus, because that's probably the right answer. And in K-12, everybody knows that the answer is it's racist, right? Or
Yes.
it's homophobic. And it's like, how hard is that? How hard is that? Like, you already know the answer, and then you're working backwards from conclusions. It reminds me of an old Saturday Night Live skit that was, you are too young to remember. I'm sure it was, there's this restaurant called Beefsteak Charlie's, but they did it and they called it pre-chewed Charlie's, and they would like chew your food for you, and then they would drop it in your mouth like you're a baby bird. And that's what it's like. It's like, this is all
perfect
pre-chewed,
analogy.
pre-digested, and the kids are bored out of their gourds. And like I said, in some places they're starting to push back.
I think this is kind of a good segue into our kind of main topic for today, or what we really wanted to dive into, because this is a project that I worked with you on. You spearheaded the project, so I kind of went along. I rode shotgun for it, and I loved it. So, and it was about cults, because some of what you're talking about, where they're just sort of spewing out an answer before even the answer is already predetermined, right? Sort of what you're talking about. So that kind of leads me to connect the dots here with what a cult, kind of the cult mentality is. So let's kind of look at that for a moment. So you decided you wanted to write on cults. What interested you? What did you find? What was that about? What was the target audience? Maybe if you could even summarize some of the key points that you made, I guess, that we made in the article, that would be a great start too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have pointed out that there are religious elements to this, and that, as religion was removed from the public schools, this same kind of an overarching belief system that, like, nature abhors a vacuum. So there are religious elements to this, but then there are also cults. And as we wrote in the piece, having grown up in the 70s, there was a lot of cult activity back then. And I had sort of I was exposed to a little of it on my street in a very suburban neighborhood. It was in the air back there in the 70s. And I'm just having deja vu as I'm watching what's happening, because on the one hand, this is, so I'm just observing similarities to the cults that as a child I saw happening now. And I think on the one hand, we have all of this political ideology that people are talking about. gender ideology and critical race theory, and you can really go down a very deep rabbit hole and get bogged down by all of this terminology and all of the theory. Like they literally, yeah. I mean, I dropped out. Actually, one of the podcasts I would like to do is talk to people like myself who dropped out of PhD programs because of theory, because I've met several. Leaving aside all of this really jargon-laden theory, there is the mechanism by which they're promoting it, which strikes me as cultish. And the way in which kids are presenting themselves with an entirely new identity, and that parents are saying, my child is unrecognizable to me. That sounds like a cult to me, rather than my child is deeply interested in this. You can get interested in all kinds of theories academically, but that doesn't mean that your whole identity changes, like right down to your name, or your like actually changing your body. Which is happening in some cases. So with that in mind, I wouldn't even say a deep dive into the cult literature, but I did a medium. I did a semi-shallow dive into the cult literature. And my goal was not to present myself or ourselves as cult experts, because we're not, but to try to point parents in the right direction, because the 70s came and went. And there are when you didn't used to be able to go to an airport without being attacked by, Moonies and whatnot back then. Now you can. So, I do believe this too shall pass. But more than that, I think that there are lessons that were learned during that era on how to deal with somebody who is ideologically captured to this extent, that we can learn from and apply today. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So like, how do you reach someone who is so ideologically captured? And so I'll just pause there.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're saying that you did a medium or a shallow dive into the cult literature, what literature did you consult?
Well, we list several resources in each of these articles, because we want parents to go directly to those sources. But the main one I went to is Steve Hassan, who was, pardon?
A former Mooney himself.
Yes, he was a former Mooney. And I actually was at a parents' conference where a lawyer who was a parent said, dropping your kids off at school these days is like dropping them off with the Moonies.
Sure.
And that really scared, that's a very upsetting observation. Yes, so he is a former Mooney. He was captured. And so he offers his tips, and then we just give him full credit and sort of reiterate some of the best tips. And the main one that I think is really like, there's a saying from Winston Churchill once said that a fanatic is someone who can't change their mind and won't change the subject. And I think that probably the number one tactic is, don't try to out argue someone, including your own child, who is captured by this ideology. Probably the best tactic is oblique, change the subject. And you need to try to connect with them in a different arena, doing things together. Leave it aside. Don't try to, it's kind of like if your child is in a bad romance, and then if you try to break it up, you just drive them closer together.
Yes.
So you want to, a really good starting tactic is to like, hey, let's go camping. Let's go bowling. Let's go do something fun together, where you try to reconnect with the child at something completely separate, where this stuff is so heavy and it's so tied up with the child's social networks and their sense of belongingness. So that is a good start. Christine, what else?
Yeah, you know what I think of when, yes, I mean, you captured it beautifully, but what I think of when I think of distraction is sort of some of the ways we might treat obsessive compulsive disorders, and those kinds of anxiety disorders is actually to distract, right? And that's not the only thing, but it can be a very useful intervention. And in some way, the way that you're kind of describing this cultish way of thinking sounds very obsessive compulsive in a sense.
And kids who might be OCD might be more vulnerable. And we talked about that. And Steve Hassan, I actually first came across him giving a talk to the Asperger's Association of New England. And I think it's pretty clear that kids on the spectrum are more susceptible, kids with social.
Yes. And targeted more often for these kinds of grooming type of movements and whatnot.
Yeah, it's certainly well observed at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, social skills building is one way that concerned teachers can help to prevent susceptibility to this kind of problem. And another technique of trying to reach these kids is to going back to the whole Asperger's spectrum-y kind of thing. I like to give the example that I've heard is if you have a kid who's overly focused on something, say for example Legos or whatever it is, Legos. Instead of trying to just say, hey, Legos are dumb, come on, let's stop doing Legos, you sit down with the child and you do some Legos for a while and you sort of join them in their world. And then you talk, what is it about these Legos that you find interesting? Let's do some Legos together. And that's how you lead them out. So maybe Hassan, and I know this is hard for parents, but Hassan would suggest that people who are drawn to these, there are some positive reasons why they're drawn to this that you could probably address and build on. A lot of these kids really think that they are fighting hate. And that's a good thing, to think that you're fighting hate. We might think that they are misguided and maybe misinformed, and maybe the specter of hate is being exaggerated, but regardless, they think that they're doing a good thing, and that's admirable. So you want to look for the positive traits or the positive needs, that the cult-like ideology is filling for this child, and then maybe there are other ways to meet the same needs.
Yeah. Bonnie, you might not know, but when I was young, we grew up as Protestants in South Africa. And in my high school years, my mom, my brother, and myself, we became Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm very well familiar with cult dynamics from the Jehovah's Witnesses setup. And I can just affirm what you said there, that engaging in these types of arguments with someone who's really intrigued and who's really bought into a type of cult mindset won't bring you anywhere. But to build relationship, that is one of the best ways in which you can meet a person where you find them. And you mentioned that nature wants to fill a void. What I found, not only reflecting in on my history, but also what I found among teenagers who tend to be swallowed up into these types of movements, is they want to fill a map that wasn't there in the first place, or a map that's not reliable enough. So it is a security type response. Without a map, there is immense anxiety, there is existential loss of security, and they cling to that newfound map of life. And it is wrong-headed to try and disrupt that, because then they have nothing again.
It's about joining with the client in a sense, right? And this is what we say in therapy, is we join with the client rather than try to go and kind of change based on our agenda. We join with them first. And once we do that and build that relationship, and what you're even describing, Bonnie, about sitting down and playing with the Legos, this is what we do with child and adolescent therapy. We actually sit down and play the game with them, rather than, kind of try to argue the point or whatever. And so in some ways, a lot of the ways that you're talking about working with them are kind of these basic, therapeutic, understandings of how to best work with kids and how to best work with adolescents. But I think I'm going to venture to say that I will speak for myself, that there is so much panic and chaos and disarray around, I don't want to align with this, because if I do, then this poor kid is lost. And, that book, Getting Out of the Gender Cult, that Maria Keffler book, I really love a lot. She's a social worker and had written quite a bit about this and about the importance of sort of joining, in a sense, and not aligning in reinforcing this kind of stuff, but in learning more about their world, right? I want to step into your world to understand your world a little bit better. And that in and of itself creates a sense of trust and rapport and connection. But I think, again, for me, it's just so terrifying, or had been so terrifying, to kind of do that and say, and I think parents feel that way too, well, I don't want to align with this and make it seem okay. But if we return back to the roots of how we actually connect with adolescents and children, that's just exactly what we do first. Is we sit down and play the game, right? Even Jaco, I'm sure with child clients you've had, we used to take walks on the basketball court and play basketball with some of them, because that's the only way they would talk, right? So it defied the whole sitting room.
Now I'm thinking of those groovy rap sessions they like to have.
Yes.
Well, what you're describing in education is Rogerian, Carl Rogers' unconditional
acceptance. Very much.
And you do have to be unconditionally accepting of the child, and the child does have free will, but you want what's best for the child, and you probably think that this is not what is best, but like the whole point of unconditional acceptance is to say, this is you, and this is where you are right now, and that's okay. This is where you are right now, and I love you unconditionally, and then that, then you build that relationship. I'm a big believer now, in effectiveness training, and this would be considered kind of a values conflict, and there are ways of negotiating those. You want to, I think Hassan recommends sort of when they're ready, leading them to alternative sources of information, because as you described, they have this one map, and that is. And to one extent, it makes me sad that we have done such a poor job of providing them with an alternative map, that they think this one is better. I think some of that is on our churches, and, for not having done a better job of providing kids with a worldview that gives them comfort and peace and calm and a sense of security. But that is also one feature of a cult, is that it has this idea that is the single answer for everything.
Yes.
And that's I'm reminded in Italian the word for fanatic or fan is tifoso, and it literally comes from the word typhus, which is a fever, a delirium that you have, and so you are dealing with someone who's maybe not thinking very clearly, obviously.
I think something else that parents might have to keep in mind is to have it clear in their own minds where the deal breakers are, where the boundaries lie. When I want to use the Jehovah's Witnesses as an example again. If a child, say a teenager, comes to a parent and says, "Mom, Dad, I am interested in joining this high control religion," I think it is necessary for parents, like we said, to meet the child where they are, but to have it clear in their mind how far they would permit the child wandering into this space.
Right.
Because if that child one day says, "I will refuse blood transfusions," it should be clear in the minds of the parents whether they would refuse it or not. And I would hope parents would say, "You're free to practice your religion, but that is where I draw the line."
Well,
the same with gender ideology.
We're having this parents' rights versus child's rights argument right now. There is, I'm told, a movement too, the whole child or the whole school movement, where they're trying to get more medical interventions being provided via schools, which concerns me a great deal. As a guidance counselor, occasionally you have to report parents who you think are not doing their jobs? Very, very rarely. A lot of schools now seem to be starting with the position that parents are dangerous to kids in general.
Yes.
Obvious
Yes.
is way too extreme. You remind me though, like my grandmother, bless her heart, after she was widowed, was visited by the Mormons, and she joined the Mormons. And I don't have anything against the Mormons, and but I have interesting childhood memories of the Mormons trying to recruit me and my brother, to the point where they literally would wait for us after school and chase us down the street. And yeah, and it's very, and my father eventually went to the temple and said, if you do that again to my children, I will report you. And you know, I was taken to the Mormon temple a couple times, and my cousins very sweetly said, look, they're very nice people. You can eat their cookies and you can drink their Kool-Aid, but don't believe what they tell you. Which, and I was the youngest cousin. So, and I have nothing against the Mormons. I actually think that you know, there's probably something really positive going on there, because a lot of really wholesome people seem to be Mormons. I don't know. And maybe I shouldn't go any further down that path. But I guess I did. It just reminds me of that when you talk about, I don't know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses either. I imagine that some people are very happy with their involvement with it. I don't know. But when does it become concerning? What is the mind control that you're talking about?
Well, they're also a totalizing, high control religion. They also believe that you need to start moving into the cult and start severing relationships with people on the outside.
Yes, that is,
endorsing
yes.
endorsing the theology, having some extremist positions around, like I said, medical treatment such as blood transfusions, changing the lingo, the exclusivity of it, and
cutting you off
of
from family members, cutting you off from outsiders is very high warning. That's very high warning.
I mean, isn't it similar to being in an abusive relationship, right? What's one of the first things that happens is you get cut off from the outside. Right. So these are all tactics, I feel like, that are used in some way to control, manipulate, etc., in different contexts, whether it's a cult or whether it's an abusive relationship, etc., fill in the blank. It's almost coming from the same core tactics and manipulative antics to make it happen.
Your reality testing is cut off.
Completely. Yes, absolutely.
And I think that the government actually has standards that define what a religion is versus what is not a religion, because there are supernatural aspects to well accepted religions. I actually saw a commercial last night that I wanted to mention that said it was selling a mattress, and it said, you'll look at having a new mattress can make you look at life from a whole new perspective. And it's this young woman lying in bed, and she's looking up at the ceiling, and she goes, oh, that book group that wanted me to move to the woods is a cult. And it just, you know, I knew I was going to be doing this today. So that's what you need, is you need a space where you can think clearly, so that you can have a new perspective. And that's what they try to prevent you from doing. They try to keep you so busy, so caught up in it. They create enemies, right? And the haters. This idea that everyone who's not with us hates us, I think is often reminiscent of is kind of a feature of this kind of activity.
We're drawing parallels here, and we're discussing what parents can do who find themselves in a situation where a child might come home reporting that they're transgender, for instance, and how to go about dealing with that. And by the time the child comes home with such a declaration, they would have already built a type of an online network that would have already been provided with a lot of material, reality disrupting, reality defying material online. They're already scripted. They have their slogans, their shortcut answers and arguments ready for parents. I think it is necessary for parents to have it clear in their mind how far they would go in meeting their child, and even to communicate that to the child. You're fine to explore this, but there are certain things that we will not go along with. We will not endorse medical treatment, for instance. Once you turn 18, we will still love you. We will still care for you. It would break our hearts if you went along with it and eventually go into hormone treatment. But up until then, that is a non-negotiable. don't even expect of us, don't even ask us to consider that. That's just an example.
Well,
To
I
have
think
it-
I think
to
what you're
have a few
describing too
minds-
is proactive, getting ahead of it, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's probably strategies for that, and then there's strategies when it's too late for that too.
Yes.
What do you have in mind?
Well, I mean, the main thing I have in mind is that people should read the article and look at the recommendations at the end of the article, the
Yes.
resources where there are more, experienced experts in this particular topic. I do know that there are parents. I mean, as a parent, you have the right to relocate. I know that there in the United States, there are some states that don't allow transitioning of minors. And so a person who's really that concerned in that kind of a situation might consider, and I have talked to parents who've done it, something as drastic as that's it. I'm quitting my job. We're moving to, I don't know, name the state that where a fresh start. And that there's also this thing called a hammer. And if you apply it with force to a computer or a cell phone, you can disable the devices.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Hammer.
That's
Take a hammer to it.
That has been one of the most destructive wedges in families, the access that they have to certain pieces of
I think the
information.
non-negotiable part is extremely key. And I think doing that with love, making clear that I love you unconditionally and I will not tolerate this, and I will not support this, or whatever the case may be. And I don't think this is the right decision. As your parent, I'm responsible for making decisions for the best, your own best good until X amount of years when you're an adult. And that whole, even 18, in my opinion, is too young because the brain isn't even fully formed. But right,
legally, you have no
legally, we don't have any recourse. Correct. And so, but I think that's so counterintuitive a lot to parents, because to them it sounds like it's condoning, and that's a very clear distinction between condoning the decision and saying I support you unconditionally and love you no matter what, but I do not agree or find this to be in your best interest. And I think that's what's hard, is parents are afraid to lose their kid. I mean, they're being told, and this is, I've heard this from so many colleagues, I don't think I can even count. It's been so many, the number of people that have said, well, listen, if your child doesn't, get supported in this transition, they're going to kill themselves. This is creating suicidality in children, and that terror of a parent, and that's where I guess I find my empathy for them is that you're afraid and terrified that your kid's going to kill themselves if you do not align with. And the fact of the matter is that that's not actually true. That's not going to necessarily happen. That's not a definitely going to happen situation. The percentages are very low of that, of even attempted suicide for that reason.
Well, and that sounds like emotional blackmail, right? Isn't that just
completely emotional blackmail? And the problem was when you have therapists, by the way, Yako knows how passionate I am about this problem. When you have therapists, by the way, who are colluding with the children and having a meeting with the parents and saying, listen, this is, and again, the therapists themselves might think they're doing the right thing. Okay, I'm not going to assume malintent there. But what I'm saying is the collusion with that, okay, because the therapist is looked at as an expert. They're looked at as somebody who understands child adolescent development. I better listen because the therapist, who's more educated than I am, knows more about child and adolescent, development, which the therapist does not know more about your child than you do. You know your child better than the therapist, I could say.
And
most
we do make
of the time
recommendations on how to find trustworthy
yes
counselors.
correct
That are in many cases ideologically captured, and not to mention the number of transitioned youth who attempt suicide. I mean,
yes,
I don't think there's any evidence that it does prevent it.
What we do know is that the incidence of suicide attempts among minors with gender dysphoria isn't necessarily higher than a comparative psychiatric population.
Right? Because most attempted suicides from kids are based upon circumstances that are changeable. It's over 90%, because I used to work with suicide prevention in a former life. It's over 90% of attempted suicides are with children in the adolescent group, I should say, not the children, but the adolescent high school group, let's say 9 through 12. 8 grades 9 through 12 are over changeable circumstances, which means that it's impulsive, and the circumstance will eventually change that's driving you to do that. So if we know that and we're equipped with that, and we know that it's not mostly the result of mental health illness, that gives us a lot of empowerment to make some different decisions and work with the child in a different way.
Yep.
So
And
what the early intervention study from the Tavistock also indicated was that some of these minors who have transitioned did not show an improvement in their mood after transitioning.
There you
And
go.
this is a long-term study. So the evidence seems to be quite clear. And then obviously the other argument is, why not target the suicidality and seek the what the cause of the suicidality might be, as opposed to just assume that once you fix the person's gender, that the suicidality will just clear up miraculously. It is just the biggest nonsense psychological formulation that anyone could ever have thought out. Change the person's gender and their suicidality will clear up, without even adequately exploring the depths of that person's distress.
And that's the big thing, is the difference between exploratory therapy and affirmative therapy.
Right.
And that is, these little tweak in that, vantage point creates a completely different outcome and result than affirmation versus exploration. Right.
I love that too, because the exploration allows time and space for all sorts of different possibilities to enter, whereas affirmation is starting from it's the beginning and the end, right? It's like go from A to Z, and we know, and then we're going to, it's hard actually to believe sometimes that we're living through this time. I know a teacher who talks a lot about the forced sterilizations that happened, we learned about probably in school, of mentally disabled people and so on. And you think, how could anyone ever do such a thing? Well, we're living through it now, aren't we? And are we any better?
That is what pathological and toxic empathy brings you.
Toxic
missing
empathy,
missing the wood for the trees, and you ruin people's lives in the process of it. Well,
and maybe we can capitalize on some of that empathy and steer it in a positive direction and say, look, a lot of these kids really have social skills deficits that might derive from completely different causes that can be managed through different kinds of training, and we can help that energy to become positive rather than toxic and destructive. Because a lot of these kids are crying out for help, and I think that this is not helpful for most of them, what they're being offered. I think it's serving adults' needs in most cases.
Many cases. So I think, like you said, again, I'm going back to nature filling a void. It is necessary for parents to hold the structure. It is precisely, in many cases, because of a disruption of structure, the map we talked about, that the children fixate on alternatives. And it is necessary for parents then to demonstrate they're holding the structure while they allow the child to explore for as long as they need to.
Containment, boundaries.
That's it, containment and boundaries.
It's also been natural for parents to trust the school and to assume that the teacher would not do anything to undermine the values they're teaching at home. And that's been true for centuries. Certainly my parents could drop their kids off at school with that safe assumption and go on with their day and pick me up at the end of the school and not think that anything nefarious or underhanded or undermining had happened during the school day. And parents can no longer safely make that assumption. And we are in this very transitional period right now between where this has been happening, but there's this gap where it's been happening before parents quite picked up on it, but now parents are onto it, and we do have this number of kids who've been caught up in this interim, right? What do we do? We need to put our heads together. What do we do? How can we help? But pause. I think pausing is certainly the first step.
Hannah Arendt speaks of the atomized person. When individuality is taken to such an extreme that a person eventually stands alone. And that has most certainly been the trend in the West, where we've focused so much on the individual, which is in and of itself not a bad thing. It is precisely because of the autonomy and the sovereignty of the individual that we had the Enlightenment in the West. This would not have been possible in a collective society such as China or Africa or the Middle East. It is precisely because of the focus of the individual that we have the Enlightenment, the freedom to disagree. But that also has a shadow side, because that isolates the person, it isolates the family. People feel disconnected. When you're disconnected, you're vulnerable. That is where the ideologues could swoop in and start picking out the vulnerable ones, individuals and families.
A virtue carried too far becomes a vice.
There Absolutely. You go.
So this is also a wake-up call then to rebuild networks.
Yes.
Especially among parents and families.
This was something that very much showed up in my own upbringing, if we're kind of looking at this even personally, because, you know, I grew up in a home that was extremely not Middle Eastern. So my parents, well, my mother, I will say not my father, my mother stepped outside the mold and said, you know what, we're going to do things the way the West does it. Okay. So the difference there is that we were very much pushed toward that direction. And then we developed our own ideas and thoughts and individualism and all of that at the cost of having connection with extended family members who were very, very close to each other and who always had a network, because at the end of the day, we didn't align in our belief processes and we were pushed toward that. So there were benefits. The shadow there was the isolation within my own family, that we were isolated, right, within our own family, and that we sought to, and I say we sought, meaning my sister and I, to find families in other ways. The benefit to that is that we broke the mold. We were the mold breakers, and we went further in school than anybody else, and we did greater things in our careers because we were encouraged to. So personally, I can feel that same advantage and disadvantage of being pushed toward this individualism, the isolation that occur, but also the freedom of thought that can occur too, where there are no bounds.
Yeah, so individualism taken too far becomes every man for himself.
Yes, exactly, which is a very scary place. I mean, and if you're talking about kids and adolescents, even as an adult, this is very hard to deal with and navigate, and you know, needing to find your own networks and actively look for them. Imagine then the children and adolescents, right? How are they going to go find something? Those groups are going to find them, is what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
And fill in the answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
but I think it has also been a wake-up call to American families to realize that there has been a fundamental betrayal to their trust, to their assumption that their schools would uphold their cherished value systems. And it was necessary for this disruption to take place, for them to notice the feral elements within their ranks that have been toxifying and that have been alienating their children from their own parents and their own families. And it has been, certainly from my vantage point, it has been encouraging. I get goosebumps when I listen to some of those parents, Christian, gay, atheistic, Muslim parents, taking a firm stand for decency. Right. Decent values upon which a functioning society will be built, and to highlight the queer perversion that their children and their schools have been subjected to, and to put down their foot and say, we will not settle for this. To find pleasure in seeking out the next thing to violate and to transgress. That is queerness for you in the real sense of the word. And that is, in psychoanalysis, perversion. And I'm saying it as a married gay man myself.
Yeah, the need to shock, and just the whole critical, I've been saying for a long time, it's like kids don't even know, they only know the criticism. They don't know the thing that's being criticized. It's like critical race theory. It's like only reading a review of the movie and never seeing the movie and then telling people what it was like.
Yes.
That bothers me tremendously. You can't be fed a steady diet of nothing but critiques and not be miserable, alienated, confused, and probably angry.
Yes. Yeah. So I think education, parents educating themselves on what has been going on might be greatly valuable. And eventually, as soon as they start noticing that they have greater confidence in what they know in terms of America's history, what they know in terms of what these ideologues are arguing, that they can start expressing appreciation for what they do have, the heritage that has made America and the West such a successful enterprise, and to bit by bit to share that and to demonstrate that appreciation, because this also comes with taking these things for granted. It is not in and of itself a bad thing to know what you have. It makes sense that generation after generation, knowing the same thing, never feeling a threat of your heritage, of your nation, your safety, to feel like this is the way it ought to be, this is the way it's always been, and to assume that this will always be this way. Makes sense. Psychologically, it makes sense. But I think this disruption, this sudden threat, should just make families in America realize what they do have. And you can't just assume that the system will take care of itself. I'm speaking from experience, seeing the deterioration in South Africa. Assuming that all those structures would just take care of themselves is a false assumption. You need to first appreciate those structures, appreciate the principles upon which they've been built, and you better maintain and transfer that knowledge to the next generation. If you don't do that, you can forget those structures will not hold.
I like your point that like this had to happen, and it reminds me of this concept of fragility, and that kids, the kids are actually anti-fragile, like our bones are anti-fragile, and without stress, without challenge, you become weak and you atrophy.
Yes.
So it is good that we're going through this challenge, because it does force us to confront why things have been the way they are, and to recommit ourselves to the values that we do believe in, and to be forced to justify the good things that are, why they are that way. And if there's anything that we need to correct, it's sure, we're willing to adjust and course correct, but there are many things that simply need to be defended as good and right and proper and true.
Yes.
It's nice to see people standing up and doing so.
We're coming to the end of our time together for today. So I just wanted to see if there are any kind of final closing thoughts. I know we covered such a breadth of topics today and kind of how these all intersect, but Bonnie, are there any kind of closing thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience based on your work with the cults?
I think my thoughts are that trust, have faith, don't panic. I mean, this is what faith is for.
Yes.
Is for times, right? Have faith. Don't panic. I think that most parents have built good foundations with their kids. You're going to have to trust in that, stay calm. And we don't have all of the answers, but we do have a really good list of resources of people who have great answers. And I would suggest maybe instead of such a deep dive into the critical theory and the gender ideology, take a look at some of the cult literature and how to deal with somebody who's been in what do they call it when you're introduced to a cult, or inducted into a cult?
Inducted.
Yeah. I think we've maybe gone a little too far into the theory, and I think we need to look more into the methods, and that we might make some headway and restore some balance that way.
That is all for today's episode. So we are happy to have you, and take good care, Bonnie, and hopefully we will be able to have you again sometime in the near future.
My pleasure. Thank you.